The smell of burnt pine still hung in the hallway as I opened the door and heard my grandson mocking my cement hands to his friends. Still, I set the gift bag down quietly, letting that same smoky scent settle around me like a witness. As their laughter thinned, the pine smoke deepened, curling through my breath, steadying my pulse. While I stood there, I realized the smell wasn't from the tree. It was from every winter I spent building this family's foundation alone. The same scent reminded me how easily they forgot the hands that raised their walls. That's when I decided, justice doesn't need anger, just the truth placed exactly where it can be seen. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. Frank Miller stepped out of his old pickup, its engine ticking in the cold as Christmas lights from his son's house glowed like a showroom display. The place looked more like a magazine cover than a home: sleek glass windows, stone siding, an oversized wreath that probably cost more than his monthly pension. He brushed at his flannel shirt, the fabric softened by years but washed fresh that morning. It wasn't fashionable, but it was clean and it was his. He took a breath, squared his shoulders, and walked toward the front door. Inside, warmth and polished surfaces wrapped around him. Tara's voice floated from the dining room, clipped and rehearsed, giving last-minute instructions about silverware placement as if the governor were coming. The smell of expensive candles mixed with roasted turkey. Frank murmured his greetings, removed his coat, and took a seat at the far end of the long, gleaming table. The chandelier above him glittered like a reminder that he didn't quite belong here. As he lowered himself into the chair, Jacob leaned sideways toward his friends, too loudly for an accident, just loud enough to be heard across the table, and whispered, "Grandpa still smells like cement." The words landed heavier than the holiday china. For half a second, silence hovered. Then it broke. Michael let out a chuckle that tried to sound casual. Tara's lips curled with a smirk she didn't bother hiding, and even one of Jacob's friends snorted through their nose. Only one face didn't join: Emily's. Her eyes shot up in horror, wide and apologetic, as if she wanted to rake the words back out of the air before they reached Frank. Frank felt the sting travel through him like frostbite, slow, numbing, deceptively deep. He swallowed, forcing a smile onto his face, the kind he mastered decades ago when he had to pretend that long days and aching knees didn't wear him down. His hands, still rough from years of masonry, tightened around the edges of the napkin. Cement. They laughed as if his life's work was a punchline. Conversation stumbled for a moment, then resumed with the clink of expensive cutlery. The turkey was carved, wine poured, and stories shared, well, not shared, repeated. Rehearsed anecdotes for the sake of image. Frank sat quietly, the humiliation settling like dust in his lungs. He didn't lash out, didn't correct them, didn't tell Jacob that the scent he mocked was the same one that paid for Michael's first car, his college tuition, and half the roofs in this town. He simply breathed in, steady and controlled. Midway through dinner, Michael leaned back with a grin and tapped his glass with a fork. "You know," he said loudly, "Dad's work ethic is something else. Old-fashioned. Outdated, really. They don't make men like that anymore." The table laughed again, though the remark was less joke and more jab, wrapped in a tone that made Frank feel like a relic on display. Emily shifted uncomfortably, glancing between her father and grandfather. She mouthed a soft sorry, her eyes glistening with a quiet loyalty that Frank clung to like a lifeline. He kept his smile, thin, polite, unshakable on the surface. Inside, a small fracture opened. Not anger, something quieter, colder. The kind of disappointment that settles deeper than rage ever could. He watched his son, once a boy who followed him to work sites with pride, now embarrassed by the same calloused hands he used to brag about. Watched his grandson mimic that disdain without understanding it. The hum of conversation seemed distant. Tara displayed her new bracelet, talking about the custom renovation of their home, how the designers transformed the place from the ground up. Michael nodded proudly. never acknowledging that the original foundation beneath them was built by Frank's own hands 44 years ago. The irony slithered around the room unnoticed by everyone but him. A tightness built in his chest, not from age but from clarity. They didn't understand him. They didn't see him. They enjoyed the life he built but had no respect for the man who laid the first stone. He took a sip of water, letting the cold settle the storm rising beneath his calm exterior. He listened to the laughter, the careless cruelty embedded in their jokes, and realized something he hadn't allowed himself to name before tonight. They truly didn't know what he sacrificed. Not the mornings he left home before sunrise. Not the nights he came back covered in dust so his family could live better than he ever had. Not the years of aching bones, missed holidays, weathered hands, and pride swallowed long before this moment. And for the first time, Frank felt a shift inside him. Small, quiet, but unmistakable. A line had been crossed. As the laughter continued around him, he lifted his eyes toward Michael and Jacob, father and son, mocking the very foundation they stood on, and knew something had changed forever. He wouldn't say it tonight. He wouldn't argue. He wouldn't defend himself. But they had no idea what his silence was preparing. And as he placed his fork down gently, almost ceremonially, the thought crystallized. This family had no clue what was coming. Dinner moved forward, but the air never recovered. It sat thick and unmoving, like fog that refused to lift. Frank stayed quiet, chewing slowly, watching the shine of the silverware more than the people around him. Every clink of a fork, every burst of forced laughter pressed against him, reminding him that he was physically at the table, but no longer part of the family that once felt like his entire world. Tara took control of the conversation with the confidence of someone used to attention. She leaned back in her chair, manicured fingers circling a stemless wine glass as she launched into a detailed story about the remodel of their home. "We basically rebuilt the whole place from the ground up," she said, as if unveiling a grand achievement. "The designers were incredible. Honestly, it feels like a completely new house now." Her eyes glowed with pride, but each word cut Frank more deeply than she knew. From the ground up. He remembered the year he poured that foundation. Michael was barely 10, watching from the grass with a packed lunch Tara had sent him with. Frank had spent 3 weeks on that project, leveling soil, laying rebar, pouring concrete with hands that were stronger back then but just as steady. Tara didn't know any of that. She never asked. She didn't see the irony in praising designers for work built on the literal sweat he left in their soil. Michael nodded in agreement, chiming in about lighting fixtures and open concept choices. Emily smiled politely, but her gaze drifted toward Frank often, checking on him like she sensed something others didn't. Jacob, however, sensed the wrong thing. Maybe he thought the earlier laughter gave him permission. Maybe embarrassment needed an audience. But he leaned forward again, this time with a smirk, and said, "Careful, Mom. If Grandpa comes too close to the walls, he might leave cement dust everywhere." His confidence was new, bolder now, sharper. He didn't whisper this time. He wanted the reaction. Michael chuckled again, softer but still complicit. Tara pretended not to hear, though a satisfied gleam reached her eyes. The table cracked with another wave of awkward amusement, and Frank felt the shame hit differently this time, not as a surprise, but as confirmation. Emily froze. Her fork dropped gently against her plate, and her stare at Jacob wasn't just disapproval, it was betrayal wrapped in grief. She shook her head slowly, silently pleading with him to stop. Frank set his napkin down. His hands didn't shake, but they felt heavier than minutes earlier. He cleared his throat politely, the kind of sound meant to signal exit rather than conversation. "I think I should head home," he said, forcing warmth into the sentence to keep it from sounding like defeat. "It's getting late." Tara blinked as if mildly inconvenienced but not concerned. "Oh, already?" she asked, without rising or offering anything resembling sincerity. Michael muttered something about the roads getting icy, but he didn't push to keep his father there. Jacob shrugged, unbothered. Only Emily reacted like the announcement mattered. She stood so quickly her chair scraped the hardwood, grabbing her coat before anyone could question her. Frank slipped quietly into his old winter jacket, the one with the frayed cuffs and pockets worn through on the inside. He walked to the door alone, no footsteps trailing behind, until suddenly he heard the soft patter of Emily's boots. She burst outside with him, breath forming little clouds in the icy air. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around his waist and pressed her cheek into his chest. For a moment, Frank closed his eyes, letting the warmth of her hug melt the cold he had been swallowing all evening. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. Her voice trembled, not with guilt, but with empathy far older than her 15 years. He rested his hand gently on the back of her head. "It's all right, sweetheart," he murmured, though every piece of him felt like it had been saw. And dead down to rawness. She pulled back, eyes shining. "They shouldn't talk to you like that." Frank smiled faintly, the kind of smile used to protect someone else rather than himself. "You're a good girl, Emily. Don't carry what isn't yours." He didn't look back at the house as he walked down the driveway. The snow crunched beneath his boots, the cold biting deeper with each step. Streetlights washed the neighborhood in a soft yellow glow, festive yet indifferent. His breath came slow and controlled, but inside him, something bruised pulsed with every exhale. A seat at the table, he thought, but not in the family. The night swallowed the sound of the closing door behind him. The wind picked up, brushing against his face with a sting that felt almost personal. As he reached his old truck and placed his hand on the cold metal door, he paused. The ache wasn't just humiliation. It was the beginning of a realization, one that would change everything. And while the world around him glimmered with Christmas lights, Frank knew a different kind of awakening had begun. Frank's house felt smaller that night, not because the walls had shrunk, but because his chest had. He stepped inside and closed the door with a soft click, the kind that echoed even in silence. The warmth from the old radiator seeped into the room slowly, unevenly, like it always had. He stood for a moment in the dim living room, letting the quiet settle around him. No polished surfaces, no designer lights, no curated perfection. Just a home shaped by decades of work, held up by hands that still remembered the weight of tools. He drifted toward the mantel where family photos stood in mismatched frames. His fingers brushed along the wooden edge, roughened by age and use. He paused at a picture of young Michael, 10 years old, skinny arms, bright eyes, standing beside him at a job site. The boy's hair had been messy, his smile bigger than his face. He held a tiny trowel Frank had bought just for him. Behind them towered a half-finished wall of cinder block, the first project Michael ever insisted on helping with. Frank felt the memory unfold like an old film. The sun had been beating down that day, sweat running down Frank's neck as he mixed concrete in a wheelbarrow. Michael had mimicked him, clumsy but determined, splattering more cement on himself than anywhere useful. Frank remembered laughing, a deep, full laugh, as the boy proudly handed him a crooked batch of mortar, calling it "my special mix." He remembered telling Michael he was strong, that he had hands built for real work. The boy had glowed at the praise. Another memory washed over him, building Michael's childhood home. Every floorboard, every beam, every piece of framing had passed through Frank's hands. He remembered the first night they slept inside, the smell of sawdust still fresh in the air, Michael running room to room shouting, "Dad built this. My dad." Frank could still hear the echo of that pride like it lived in the walls themselves. But tonight, the house felt haunted by a different truth. He set the photo back down gently. The grief that rose inside him wasn't explosive, no heat, no rage, just a slow ache, deep and steady. Not anger for the man Michael had become, but grief for the boy he once was. A boy who admired him, a boy who learned from him, a boy who today chuckled along as his own son mocked the same past he once celebrated. Frank made his way to the small office he kept at the back of the house. The desk was old, the surface scratched from years of paperwork and tool manuals. He switched on the lamp, the yellow bulb casting a warm circle over the folders stacked neatly in rows. He pulled them closer, financial files he had kept organized long before his memory started slipping. Bank statements, retirement savings, the modest shares from the contracting business he once ran. But the most important documents lay at the bottom: land deeds. Several plots he bought decades ago when the town was still growing. He hadn't told Michael the full value of them, mostly because Michael never asked. He assumed Dad's just surviving on a pension. He never cared to know more. Frank flipped through the papers slowly, methodically. Not with calculation, but with contemplation. Each page felt like a piece of his life's work, quiet, steady, unseen. The kind of legacy people forget unless someone reminds them. Then something colorful caught his eye. A small folded card, tucked between the documents. Emily's handwriting decorated the front with a little sketch of a Christmas tree. He opened it carefully. Inside she had written, "Grandpa, you're the strongest person I know. Thank you for everything you've built for us and for this town. I love you." Frank inhaled shakily. Not dramatic or broken, just enough to feel the card press closer to his heart. Of all the people at that dinner table, she was the only one who still saw him clearly. Her love wasn't performative or convenient. It was earned in quiet moments, in the stories he shared with her, in the foundation she never mocked. He set the card down beside the deeds, smoothing its edges with a tenderness he hadn't used in years. The room seemed to shift around him, not brighter but sharper. The memories, the documents, the pain from tonight's dinner, all of it aligned into something undeniable. He stared at his hands, old hands, tired hands, but hands that had built futures, hands that had given without being asked, hands they laughed at tonight. He exhaled slowly, the words barely above a whisper. "They think cement is something to mock." His voice drifted into the quiet room, but the weight of it stayed. And as he looked back at the files beneath the lamplight, something inside him moved. A small, deliberate shift. A choice beginning to form. Frank woke early the next morning, though he hadn't slept much. The winter sun had barely risen when he buttoned his coat, stepped out into the brittle cold, and headed toward town. The quiet crunch of snow beneath his boots was steadying, almost cleansing, after the heaviness of the night before. He didn't have a clear plan, only a tug in his chest pulling him toward someone who still remembered who he was before age and family disappointment dimmed the edges. Mayor Dan Sullivan's office sat above the old courthouse, a brick building Frank had helped reinforce nearly 30 years earlier. He climbed the familiar steps slowly, each one creaking with the same stubbornness he admired. When he reached the landing, the door swung open before he could knock. "Frank Miller," Sullivan said with a grin that reached his tired eyes. "I was hoping I'd see you before the holiday week got too crazy." Frank nodded, offering a small smile. "Morning, Dan. Thought I'd stop by if you had a few minutes." "For you, always." The mayor stepped aside and ushered him in. "Come on, I've got fresh coffee, the good kind, not the courthouse kind." Frank followed him inside the warm, cluttered office. Papers were stacked in loose piles, maps pinned to the walls, Christmas cards taped unevenly to cabinets. It wasn't polished or curated. It was lived in. Real. The kind of room where a man's work showed without apology. Sullivan poured 2 mugs and handed one to Frank. "You look tired," he said gently. "Everything all right?" Frank took a sip, letting the bitter heat settle on his tongue before answering. "Just a long night with the family. Made me think about some things." Sullivan leaned back in his chair, studying him with the familiarity of an old friend who had seen him through too many seasons. "Frank, you've earned the right to think about anything you want. You built half this town with your 2 hands. Schools, clinics, homes. You set more foundations than any contractor within 50 miles. He shook his head, almost proudly. "There are people walking around with their lives intact because you leveled a ground or repaired a beam before it collapsed." Frank looked down at the coffee, the compliment settling awkwardly on him. Praise wasn't something he ever knew what to do with. Those were different days. People appreciated the work back then. They still do, Sullivan said firmly. Don't confuse a few ungrateful voices with the truth. Frank let that sit between them. It was comforting, and yet last night's laughter still stung in a place praise couldn't reach. They talked for a while about old job sites, mutual friends who had aged into softer versions of themselves, and the changes creeping through the town, stores closing, new businesses struggling, families shifting away. Sullivan's voice had a familiarity Frank needed, a reminder that some parts of his life still made sense. After a moment, the mayor leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You know, Frank, I've been wanting to do something for you, something public, a ceremony or recognition for your work, maybe a plaque in the square. He lifted his hands as if presenting the idea. A lot of people don't get thanked until they're gone. I'd rather do it while you can still hear it. Frank's shoulders tensed. Attention had never been his aim. He shook his head gently. I appreciate it, Dan, really, but I don't need my name in lights. That's not the kind of mark I want to leave. Sullivan's brow furrowed, but he didn't push. All right, he said softly. Then what kind of legacy do you want? Frank didn't have an answer, not yet. They sat in a comfortable silence until Sullivan rubbed his jaw as if deciding whether to mention something else. Since you're thinking about the future, he began, I should tell you Jacob's school is in trouble. Budget cuts, outdated equipment, understaffed workshops. The trades program might not make it through next year, he sighed. It's a shame. Kids deserve hands-on learning, especially boys like Jacob. Frank's eyes lifted at the mention of his grandson's name. The irony twisted in the air between them. Jacob, who had mocked cement at our table, attended a school held up by programs fighting to survive. Programs that taught the same skills he dedicated his life to. Sullivan shrugged. The district needs help, real help. They're trying, but the funding just isn't there. Frank didn't respond immediately. A quiet stir worked its way through him. Not anger, not bitterness, but something sharper. Purpose, maybe, or clarity. The mayor's words nudged loose a direction forming in the back of his mind, fragile but present. He set the coffee cup down slowly, fingers steady. That school, he murmured, it's struggling. Sullivan nodded, badly. Frank absorbed the information, the weight of it settling beside everything he had thought about since the night before. The laughter, the disrespect, the forgotten history, and now this, an opening he hadn't been searching for, but one that appeared anyway. An idea flickered, small but bright enough to hold on to. When Frank stood to leave, the mayor watched him with curiosity. You okay, Frank? Frank adjusted his coat, eyes thoughtful. I think I'm starting to be. He stepped into the brisk winter air, the cold biting his cheeks, but his mind warmer than it had been in days. A plan still unshaped, still forming, had begun to breathe. Frank arrived at Attorney Paul Reeves's office just after noon, the winter sun settling low over the courthouse square. The old brick building looked the same as it had for decades, stoic, weathered, reliable. It reminded Frank of himself in a way. He pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped inside, greeted by the faint smell of paper, coffee, and old wood. A receptionist waved him through without asking questions. Everyone here knew him. Paul's office door was half open. Come in, Frank, his familiar gravelly voice called. Paul Reeves, 61, silver-haired but sharp-eyed, stood from behind his desk with the kind of slow ease that comes from knowing his work still mattered. He extended a hand. Good to see you. You don't usually come by without calling. Everything all right? Frank shook his hand and lowered himself into the chair across from him. I needed to talk. Something happened last night. Paul nodded knowingly. Family. Frank exhaled long and steady. Yeah, family. The attorney folded his hands atop a thick binder, one Frank recognized, though he hadn't seen it in years. I pulled your file when your message came in this morning. You've done well for yourself, you know. Better than your son gives you credit for. Frank raised a tired eyebrow. How do you figure? Paul adjusted his glasses and opened the binder. Frank, you have more saved than Michael realizes. Between your retirement, the business proceeds, and the land investments, you're sitting on significant assets. Assets that could change lives if used wisely. He flipped to another section. These commercial plots you bought back in the 90s, they've tripled in value, maybe quadrupled. Frank leaned back, letting the information wash over him. He had never cared about numbers beyond necessity. Money wasn't something he flaunted. It was simply a tool to provide stability. He never felt a need to broadcast what he owned. Michael doesn't know about any of this, Paul added gently. No, Frank murmured. He never asked. The attorney nodded, understanding without judgment. He slid a document toward Frank, the current will. Frank stared at his own signature, dated 12 years earlier, back when family gatherings still felt like family gatherings, back when Michael spoke to him with pride instead of discomfort. The will was simple, everything divided evenly among Michael, Tara, Jacob, and Emily. Paul cleared his throat. Is this still what you want? Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the weight of the paperwork settle on his chest. Images of last night crept into his mind, the laughter, the dismissive smiles, the mocking tone his own grandson used like a knife. And the worst part, Michael's participation. Not silence, participation. But then came Emily's face, the only apology offered, the only arms that held him when he left. He swallowed, the memory tightening something inside him. Paul, he began carefully, does the will have to stay that way? Paul looked up slowly, studying him with the calm patience of a man who'd guided countless clients through turning points like this. He shook his head. A will stays the way you want it to stay, Frank. Nothing is fixed, not unless you want it to be. Frank felt something shift then, not anger but clarity. The kind that comes unexpectedly, like the moment you realize a bridge you've been walking on for years has quietly cracked beneath your feet. His entire life, he had believed that family meant responsibility, duty. Inheritance wasn't a reward, it was continuity. But last night revealed something deeper. Michael didn't value continuity. Jacob didn't value legacy. Tara valued nothing but image. Respect was absent, gratitude was absent, Sidian was fading. Frank straightened in his chair, the decision settling into his bones with surprising steadiness. Then it shouldn't stay this way, he said quietly. Not anymore. Paul didn't react with surprise, only a slow, approving nod. Tell me what you want the inheritance to reflect. Frank looked down at his hands, the lines, the scars, the grit of a lifetime of labor. His voice came out steady. I want it to reflect respect, not bloodline. I've spent my whole life giving without asking what came back. Maybe I shouldn't have. He lifted his gaze. If they can't honor where they come from, then they don't get to inherit where I'm going. Paul listened without interruption, letting the words settle like fresh concrete, wet, shaping, soon to harden. So, Frank continued, quieter but firmer, we change it, all of it. The land, the savings, the business assets, everything. My legacy shouldn't reward entitlement, it should reward character. Paul closed the binder with deliberate gentleness. Then we'll rewrite your future, Frank, exactly as you choose. Frank nodded once, feeling the weight of the moment anchor into him. The twist wasn't dramatic, it wasn't explosive, it was something more powerful, a man deciding he would no longer let disrespect write the story of what he left behind. When he stood to leave, the air in the office felt different, charged, alive with the gravity of what he'd set in motion. He reached the door, paused, and looked back at Paul. This won't be simple, he said. Paul gave a knowing half-smile. Nothing meaningful ever is. Frank stepped into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him, his decision sealed, but the consequences still unfolding. The future he would rewrite was only beginning. Paul closed the office door behind them, giving Frank a moment to settle back into the chair that suddenly felt heavier with decision. The winter light filtered through the blinds, leaving stripes of pale gold across the desk where the thick binder lay open like a roadmap to a life Frank hadn't expected to examine so critically. He folded his hands, the skin worn and creased, and looked directly at the attorney. "I want a full restructuring of my estate," he said. The words were steady, almost calm, but inside, something shifted with the weight of finality. Paul didn't look surprised. He nodded slowly, clicking his pen open. "All right, then let's take this piece by piece." Frank rubbed his thumb across the edge of the desk, grounding himself. "I want Emily to be the primary beneficiary." Saying her name softened the room. It made the decision feel less like a break and more like a bridge. "She's the only one who sees me, not the version that embarrasses them, not the man they think time has passed by. She sees the truth, and she respects it." Paul wrote without hesitation. "She'll receive the properties, the savings, the land." "Everything," Frank confirmed. "The assets that mean something, the ones that can help her build a future, they go to her." There was no bitterness, just a quiet certainty. Paul flipped to another page in the binder. "And Jacob?" he asked gently. Frank inhaled. Last night's laughter played again in his mind, sharp and careless. But then he remembered the boy Michael once was, the one who had mixed concrete beside him with pride. Maybe Jacob wasn't lost, just misled. "He gets something," Frank said. "A symbolic amount, $1. Paul paused, pen hovering. "A symbolic inheritance is a statement, Frank. It's not subtle." "I'm not trying to be subtle," Frank replied. "I'm trying to be honest. Let him understand that respect, not entitlement, determines legacy." His voice didn't rise, it didn't need to. The truth carried its own volume. Paul nodded once and wrote the line, $1 it is." "And Michael and Tara?" he asked finally, though he already knew. Frank looked toward the window. Frost crawled along the glass, delicate and temporary, unlike the years he had spent building a life for a son who now treated that labor like a stain. "Remove them from majority benefits," Frank said. "Legally, cleanly. They will not inherit the land. They will not inherit the savings. They will not inherit the business shares." Paul looked at him, not with judgment but with a kind of quiet respect. "This is a significant change, Frank." "It's necessary," he answered. "This isn't revenge. I'm not punishing them. I'm correcting something that went wrong a long time ago." He paused, searching for the words. "If I leave everything to people who mock what built it, then I'm enabling the very disrespect that hollowed our family out." He shook his head. "I won't do that." Paul leaned back, absorbing the truth of the moment. "Legally, ethically, I support this. You're not being vindictive. You're making a values-based estate decision. Courts understand that, and more importantly, I understand it." Frank felt something loosen in his chest, relief maybe, or simply the feeling of being seen. "Is there anything else you want to add?" Paul asked. Frank hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. He unfolded a small sheet of paper handwritten earlier that morning. "Yes," he said, "I want to set up a scholarship, a fund for kids who want to learn trades, construction, masonry, electrical work. The kind of work that built this town, even if people forget that." Paul smiled, recognizing the depth behind the decision. "A scholarship in your name." Frank shook his head. "Not for recognition, for purpose." He set the paper down. "If my own son doesn't understand the value of honest work, maybe someone else will. Maybe a whole generation will." Paul reviewed it carefully. "We can structure this as a perpetual scholarship. The land income alone could fund it for decades." "That's what I want," Frank said. "Something that survives longer than the memory of last night's laughter." He didn't say the rest aloud. Something that would remind Jacob, one day, of the man behind the cement he mocked. Paul gathered the documents. "I'll draft the new will. You'll sign it tomorrow. Once filed, it becomes legally binding." Frank nodded, rising slowly. His joints ached, but his steps felt steadier than they had in years, like he'd straightened a beam that had been crooked for too long. At the doorway, he paused, looking back at the man who had guided him through one of the hardest decisions of his life. "This isn't revenge," Frank repeated quietly. Paul closed the binder with a soft thud. "No," he agreed, "this is correction." Frank stepped out of the office and into the cold afternoon wind, the weight of the new future settling over him, firm, deliberate, unshakable. Something had been rewritten today, and the consequences were only beginning to unfold. Frank hadn't visited the old construction yard in years, not since he sold the business and stepped quietly into retirement. But that morning, as frost clung to the edges of roofs and the air carried the metallic smell of winter, he felt pulled back to the place that had built not only his livelihood but his identity. He drove slowly, the tires crunching over gravel as he turned into the yard. It looked different, new equipment, new faces, but the bones of the place remained the same. Strong, familiar, honest. He stepped out of his truck, the cold nipping at his fingertips. Before he could take more than a few steps, a voice cut through the morning haze. "Frank, that you?" A group of workers paused mid-task. One by one, recognition spread across their faces, followed by wide grins. Men he had trained decades ago, older now, heavier around the middle, but still carrying the posture of people who respected the man walking toward them. "Look who's back," one called, wiping cement dust off his gloves. "The legend himself." "You taught me everything I know," another said, clasping Frank's shoulder with genuine warmth. Frank smiled, and for the first time in days it reached his eyes. "Good to see you boys," he said softly. "Place looks different, but good." "You built half these expansions before you left," someone added. "Still holding strong, just like you." Their respect wasn't loud, just real. And Frank stood in it quietly, letting the space remind him of who he was, far beyond the man mocked at a polished dinner table. A car door closed behind him. He turned to see Emily climbing out of his truck, bundled against the cold. She ran up next to him, eyes wide with curiosity as she took in the busy yard. "You used to own this," she whispered almost reverently. Frank nodded. "A long time ago, before your dad went to college, before you were born." She walked beside him as he led her through the site. Workers nodded respectfully when she passed, some even tipping their hats. She noticed. She noticed everything. Frank stopped near a large stone placed beside the office entrance, weathered but unmistakable. Emily tilted her head, puzzled. "What's this?" Frank brushed off the thin layer of frost. Beneath it, carved deep into the stone, was a name she recognized immediately. Franklin J. Miller, founder and master mason. 1978. Emily sucked in a breath, her gloved hand rising to cover her mouth. "Grandpa, I didn't know they honored you like this." Frank chuckled softly. "I didn't build this town for recognition, but the men insisted, said the place needed a foundation stone, literally." He tapped the engraving. "I suppose they meant it." Emily's eyes glistened, tears gathering before she could stop them. "You're my hero," she whispered, voice trembling with sincerity. "Not because of buildings, because of everything." Frank looked down at her, a warmth blooming under his ribs. She wasn't saying it for show. She wasn't saying it to flatter him. She meant it. And in her expression he saw something he hadn't seen in anyone but her, unshaken respect. But the moment cracked when the sound of an engine revved loudly near the entrance. A car full of teenagers rolled past, music thumping, windows cracked. Jacob sat in the passenger seat, laughing with his friends. His expression shifted when he spotted Frank and Emily standing near the yard's entrance. One of the boys nudged Jacob. "Ain't that your grandpa?" Jacob grinned, leaning out slightly. "Yeah," he called, voice dripping with sarcasm. "Checking out his old job. Probably misses all the cement dust." His friends laughed, the sound sharp and careless. It echoed through the yard like a hammer misplaced against steel. Emily stepped forward immediately, eyes blazing. "Stop it, Jacob," she shouted. "You don't even know what he's done. You don't know anything." Her voice broke, but it didn't waver. Workers nearby paused, listening. Frank felt his stomach tighten, not from embarrassment, but from the sight of one grandchild defending him while the other mocked him without hesitation. Jacob's smirk faltered for a moment, but pride stiffened his shoulders. "Whatever," he snapped, avoiding Frank's gaze. "It's just an old job, no big deal." Emily shook her head, disbelief etched into every line of her face. "You're the only one who doesn't see the big deal," she shot back. Jacob blinked, flushing under the scrutiny. Then, unable to handle either guilt or truth, he slammed the car door shut. "Drive," he muttered. The car peeled away, tires kicking up cold dust. The silence afterward felt heavier than the machines around them. Emily's breath trembled. Frank placed a gentle hand on her back, guiding her away from the road. "It's all right," he whispered. "It's not all right," she said, voice cracking. "How can he be so blind?" Frank didn't answer immediately. His eyes followed the direction Jacob's car had gone, a long sigh pulling from his chest. He finally saw it clearly, something he had refused to admit until now. Not just disrespect, not just immaturity. A generational divide. And bridging it would require more than patience. It would require a change. A change he had already set in motion. Frank hadn't planned on stopping by Michael's house that afternoon. He had only intended to drop off a box of old photographs Emily wanted for a school project. But when he pulled up to the curb, the driveway sat empty and the front door was slightly ajar, as if someone had rushed inside without checking it. He stepped out quietly, intending to knock and leave the box on the porch. Then he heard voices, sharp, strained. He froze. Inside, Michael and Tara were arguing in the kitchen. No laughter, no polished presentation, none of the curated perfection they showed the world. Frank stepped back, instinct telling him to leave, yet something in their tone held him still. "This is getting out of control, Michael," Tara hissed. "We can't keep juggling bills like this. The remodel alone." "I know what the remodel cost," Michael snapped. Tara's heels clicked across the tile. "No, you clearly don't. We went 200,000 over budget, 200,000, and the bank won't refinance again." Frank's brows tightened. 200,000 for countertops and lighting and decor they didn't need. He leaned slightly toward the open doorway, careful not to be seen. Michael groaned, rubbing his temples. "We just need to hold out until Dad's estate passes down. Once that happens, everything stabilizes. The inheritance will secure our future. It's what he's supposed to leave us anyway." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. Supposed to. Not hoped for, not appreciated. Expected. As if everything he owned existed purely to rescue them from their own choices. Tara let out a sharp breath. "You better make sure Jacob behaves until then. Last night was humiliating. If your father decides to cut us out." "He won't," Michael said quickly. "Dad's too sentimental. He'd never change anything. He'll leave everything to us because that's what family does." Frank stood frozen in the shadow of his own son's entitlement. The arrogance in Michael's voice didn't sound like desperation. It sounded like certainty. A certainty built on taking him for granted. Tara's voice lowered, cold and clipped. "Then talk to Jacob. His behavior is embarrassing our family. And if your father withdraws support because of that boy's mouth, I swear." Michael cut her off with a frustrated groan. "I'll deal with him, but what do you want me to do about the bills right now? The loan officers keep calling. We're drowning. Unless—" He hesitated. "Unless what?" Frank's jaw tightened as he waited for the rest. "Unless I ask Dad for an advance," Michael finished. "Just enough to get us through the remodel debts. He won't say no, not to my face." Frank's heart clenched, not from anger, but from the stark divide between what he knew to be true and what his son believed. Michael wasn't coming from a place of humility or responsibility. He wasn't coming to apologize for the dinner, or for the disrespect, or for the years of quiet distance. He was coming for money. Tara straightened, her voice dripping with expectation. Then ask him, and be convincing. He owes it to us after how hard we've worked to maintain this family's image. Image. That word, shallow, polished, empty, echoed painfully. Frank's fingers curled around the cardboard box he held. Inside were photos of the home he built by hand, the childhood Michael lived in, the foundation that supported every dream he had. And here he was, hearing that same son demand he continue saving an image that had nothing to do with truth. His breath came slow, controlled. If he stepped inside now, the argument would shift. Michael would smile, guilt would hide beneath charm, Tara would soften, and the lines between sincerity and manipulation would blur. But from the doorway hidden, he saw the truth clearly. Their perfect life wasn't perfect. It wasn't even stable. It was a facade, held up by credit lines, overspending, and the assumption that Frank's inheritance would fix everything. He felt neither triumph nor cruelty, just confirmation. His decision with Paul, the restructuring, the redistribution, the correction, was not only justified. It was necessary. He placed the box gently on the porch, the cardboard whispering against the wood. Without knocking, without making a sound, he stepped back toward his truck. The cold air bit at his cheeks as he walked away, but inside him, something warmed. Clarity. Resolve. By the time he reached the driver's seat and closed the door, their voices were still echoing faintly from the house, tangled in worry and entitlement. He stared through the windshield, hands resting on the wheel. Let them plan their future on expectations. They had no idea those expectations had already dissolved. Frank turned the key, the engine rumbling to life. He didn't need to hear anything more. His plan was no longer a reaction. It was a promise. And the next steps were already waiting. Frank wasn't surprised when his phone rang the next morning. He did recognize the number at first, but the hesitant pause after his hello gave it away. "Dad, it's me." Michael's voice carried that practiced softness he used when he needed something, too measured to be natural, too careful to be genuine. Frank could almost hear the script forming behind the words. "I was thinking," Michael continued, "maybe we could grab coffee today, just us, clear the air." Frank agreed, not out of eagerness but curiosity. He wanted to hear which version of his son would show up, the boy who once admired him, or the man who now treated him like a financial safety net. They met at a quiet cafe near the courthouse, a place Frank liked for its simplicity. No marble counters, no designer decor, just chipped mugs and warm light. Michael arrived late, breezing in with expensive cologne and a smile that stretched too wide. "Dad," he said, leaning in for a quick, awkward hug, "good to see you." Frank nodded, letting the gesture pass without reaction. They sat across from each other at a small wooden table. A waitress brought coffee. Michael didn't touch his. He was too busy arranging his facial expressions. "So," Michael began, exhaling dramatically, "about Christmas dinner, I just wanted to clear things up." Frank waited. "Jacob's joke," Michael continued, waving a hand dismissively, "was really just him being a teenager. You know how kids are. They say stupid things. It wasn't personal." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you think it was funny?" Michael blinked, thrown off. "What?" "The joke," Frank repeated calmly. "Did you think it was funny?" A pause, a flicker of discomfort. Then Michael took the escape route he always took, deflection. "It was harmless, Dad," he said with forced ease. "Just immature humor. He didn't mean anything by it. You shouldn't take it so seriously." Frank took a sip of his coffee, letting the warmth steady him. "I didn't take it seriously," he said evenly. I took it honestly. Michael shifted in his seat, tapping his fingers against the table. He clearly didn't want to linger on this part. Look, Dad, I'm trying to make peace here. I don't want any tension in the family. Frank didn't respond, and the silence pushed Michael to his real point. Speaking of family, Michael said, voice lowering as if discussing a sensitive secret, I've been thinking a lot about the future. Our future. You're not getting younger, and I want to make sure everything is planned out. There it was. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. With the remodel, the kids' activities, the economy being unpredictable, things have been tight. You know how it is, so I was wondering, he paused, feigning reluctance, what your plans are with your estate. Frank held still, not giving him an inch. I mean, Michael hurried on, you've always said you wanted to provide for us, for the grandkids. It would really help us secure our future to know what you intend. There was no grief in his tone, no reflection, no remorse, no recognition of the distance he himself had carved. Only expectation, only entitlement dressed in polite phrasing. Frank let out a quiet breath through his nose. You invited me to coffee, he said softly, to talk about inheritance. No, Michael insisted too quickly. I mean partly, but mostly I wanted to smooth things over. I don't want you thinking Jacob meant anything cruel. Frank studied him. The man he'd raised, the man he'd sacrificed for, the man who was now more concerned with money than with repairing what mattered. Michael, he said finally, what if Jacob meant exactly what he said? Michael frowned, confused and irritated. Dad, why are you being difficult? This doesn't have to be complicated. I'm trying here. Frank pushed his empty mug slightly toward the center of the table. Are you? Michael opened his mouth, but no convincing words followed. The silence stretched, and beneath it truth settled, thick, undeniable. Frank stood. Thank you for the coffee, he said calmly. Dad, wait, panic flashed behind Michael's eyes. You haven't answered my question. Frank placed a hand on the back of his chair, steady but distant. You asked about the future, he said, and I am thinking about it very carefully. Michael swallowed hard. So you'll tell me. Frank gave a faint, unreadable smile. When the time is right. It wasn't a yes, it wasn't a no, it was a door closing without sound. He turned and walked toward the exit, leaving Michael sitting stiffly in the sunlight-drenched cafe, his coffee untouched, his expectations suddenly, quietly, unsteady. Frank stepped into the cold afternoon air, the wind slicing sharp across his face. He didn't need to say anything more. His silence was already rewriting everything. Jacob didn't come willingly. That much was obvious from the way he slouched in the passenger seat, hoodie pulled up, headphones around his neck even though they weren't playing anything. But he was there, and that was because of Emily. She had cornered him that morn. Ing, voice low and fierce. You owe Grandpa at least one real conversation. One, after everything you said. She didn't threaten him. She didn't guilt him. She simply appealed to the part of Jacob that still remembered who his grandfather was before peer pressure and insecurity had twisted his view. And somehow it worked. Now Jacob sat beside Frank in the old pickup truck, staring out the window, pretending he wasn't uncomfortable. Frank didn't push him. He didn't fill the silence. He just drove, hands steady on the wheel, letting the quiet stretch long enough for the boy to feel it. After 10 minutes, Jacob finally asked, Where are we going? Frank nodded toward the windshield. You'll see. When they pulled up beside the community center, Jacob blinked in confusion. He'd been here plenty of times, basketball games, youth programs, school events, but he'd never really seen it. Not like this. The building stood strong and simple, built from brick and steel, the kind of structure made to last. Frank stepped out, gesturing for Jacob to follow. Come on, I want to show you something. They walked up the wide steps, their footsteps echoing. Jacob shoved his hands in his pockets, glancing around like he expected a lecture. Instead, Frank stopped at the wall just inside the entrance. Jacob's eyes landed on the first plaque. Community Center Expansion. Designed and constructed under the leadership of Franklin J. Miller. His brow furrowed. He moved to the next plaque. Miller Hall, dedicated to a lifetime of service and craftsmanship. Then another. Frank Miller Youth COURTS, built for the future of our town. He stared stunned as he moved down the line. Plaque after plaque, Frank's name carved in bronze, his work permanently etched into the walls. "You did all this," Jacob whispered. Frank shrugged gently. "Just buildings." But even the casual tone couldn't dull the truth. Before Jacob could respond, a janitor pushing a cart paused when he recognized Frank. "Well, I'll be damned, the man of the hour," he said warmly. "Haven't seen you here in months." Jacob blinked. Another worker walked by, stopping to shake Frank's hand. "We still tell the new guys the story about you finishing the west wing by hand when the cement truck broke down. Thought you were superhuman." Jacob's head snapped toward his grandfather. A third man, younger than the others, grinned. "Mr. Miller, my dad says he wouldn't have a job if you hadn't trained him. Said you were the best mason this town ever had." Frank nodded humbly, offering small smiles, not basking in any of it. The respect swirled organically around him, unforced, earned. Jacob stood frozen, his face shifting in real time. Confusion first, then disbelief, then realization. The man he mocked at dinner wasn't some relic covered in dust. He was a cornerstone. When the workers finally moved on, Jacob spoke again, voice quieter. I didn't know." Frank placed a hand on the railing, tracing a groove only he would recognize. "I never needed you to know," he said. "I just needed you not to mock what you didn't understand." Jacob's throat bobbed. His defenses, the arrogance, the smirks, the casual cruelty he'd absorbed from his parents, began to crumble. He walked a few steps down the hall, staring up at the framed photos of construction crews. Men covered in dust and sweat, standing beside beams and foundations. In several photos, Frank was there, strong, focused, younger but unmistakable. "Mom and Dad never talked about this," Jacob murmured. "That's all right," Frank replied gently. "Some truths aren't told, they're shown." They moved into the gymnasium, where sunlight streamed through skylights Frank had installed himself. The court gleamed, polished and perfect. Jacob walked to the center, turning slowly, letting the reality sink deeper. Kids played here because of his grandfather. Families gathered here. The building stood because of hands he once dismissed as relics. Finally, he looked at Frank, really looked at him. "I've been an idiot," Jacob said quietly. Frank didn't correct him. He didn't soften the moment or wrap it in forgiveness. He wasn't here to soothe, only to reveal. "What you choose to be next," Frank said, "matters more than what you were yesterday." Jacob nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling in his chest. Something shifted in his expression, not humiliation, not guilt, but awakening. A small fracture forming in the armor he had built around himself. For the first time, his worldview cracked. And through that crack, truth finally entered. Frank watched him, not triumphant, not vindictive, just patient. This wasn't revenge. This was foundation work. And the boy was finally ready for it. Frank returned home long after the lights in the neighborhood had begun to dim. Christmas night hung heavy in the air, quiet, cold, still. Yet his mind churned with a clarity that felt almost too sharp. He hung his coat on the old wooden hook by the door and moved into the living room, where a stack of photo albums lay half-pulled from the shelf. He hadn't touched them in years. Tonight, they felt like the missing pieces of a puzzle he finally needed to finish. He sat at the table, pulling the first album closer. The pages crackled when he opened them, releasing the faint scent of dust and memory. Photo after photo showed him standing beside half-built structures, tools in hand, sunburn on his neck. But the ones that held him the longest were of Michael, A boy with bright eyes and scraped knees. A boy who used to watch him with admiration so open and sincere that Frank once believed it would last forever. There was a picture of Michael, maybe 9 years old, lifting a tiny bucket of cement with both hands, struggling under the weight but grinning proudly. Another showed him riding on Frank's shoulders at the ribbon cutting of a new school wing. And then a third, taken years later, where teenage Michael still smiled beside him, unaware of the creeping embarrassment that would one day replace pride. Frank traced Michael's face with his thumb. "When did it change?" he whispered. "When did I become someone you had to hide?" The grief in him wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It flowed like a deep, steady current. He could see so clearly now. Admiration had faded into discomfort, which hardened into shame and now calcified into entitlement. Michael's journey hadn't been a fall, it had been a slow drift. And Frank had let it happen, believing silent love would be enough. But tonight, silence had a new purpose. He closed the album and rose from the table. The documents Paul had prepared sat neatly arranged on his desk in the next room. Under the lamp, the papers glowed with the weight of finality. His revised will, the updated trust, the scholarship fund agreement. Everything he had built across a lifetime, distilled into pages waiting for his signature. Frank took the pen in hand. His fingers didn't shake. He signed the first document, then the second, then the third. Each signature felt like placing a brick, deliberate, necessary, stabilizing. But there was one more clause Paul had discussed, one Frank had spent all afternoon considering. Not out of spite, but principle. He reached for the final sheet where a blank line awaited instruction. He wrote slowly, carefully. Inheritance will be granted only to family members who demonstrate respect, empathy, and responsibility toward others. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't revenge. It was a standard, the same standard he had lived his entire life by. He pressed the pen down with a final stroke, then leaned back, exhaling. The room felt different, lighter in some ways, heavier in others. A man's legacy wasn't money. It wasn't land. It wasn't property. It was the values he guarded, even when those around him discarded them. A knock on the doorframe pulled him from his thoughts. Paul stepped inside, coat still dusted with snow, having returned to finalize the paperwork as promised. "Everything ready?" he asked gently. Frank handed him the signed documents, all of it. Paul scanned the final page, nodding with quiet approval. "This clause, it's clear, enforceable, and fair. Exactly the kind of legacy you should leave." Frank offered a tired but genuine smile. "Then file it." "I'll take it to the courthouse first thing in the morning," Paul said. "By noon, it'll all be legally binding." Frank felt a weight settle and another lift. "Thank you, Paul." "Don't thank me," the attorney replied softly. "Just rest. You did something hard tonight." When Paul left, the house fell silent again. Frank returned to the kitchen table and pulled out a small stack of envelopes, thick, cream-colored paper. His handwriting, slow and steady, marked each name. Michael, Tara, Jacob, Emily. He didn't write explanations. He didn't write justifications. Each letter contained only the truth they needed to hear, nothing more, nothing less. As he sealed the final envelope, wax cooling under his thumb, he felt the shift completely. Tonight wasn't about breaking a family. It was about rebuilding the foundation they had abandoned. He placed the letters in a neat row and turned off the lamp. Tomorrow would begin a different future. A future built on respect, not expectation. A future he chose, not one forced onto him. And as he walked toward his bedroom, the weight of the night followed quietly, steady, resolute, irreversible. The town square hadn't seen a crowd like this since the 4th of July parade. Frank stood near the back, hands in his coat pockets, breath curling into the cold morning air. He hadn't asked for a public gathering. In fact, he'd told Mayor Sullivan repeatedly that a quiet announcement through the school board would have been enough. But the mayor insisted. A legacy like yours shouldn't be whispered, he said. So here Frank was, standing beneath a string of holiday lights as the mayor stepped up to the microphone, clearing his throat over the hum of chatter. "Good morning, everyone," Sullivan began. "We're here today to honor a man whose work has shaped this town more than most of us realize. A man who built not just structures but opportunities." Frank shifted, uncomfortable, wishing the cold wind would drown out the praise. But Sullivan wasn't finished. "It is my privilege," the mayor continued, lifting a small envelope, "to announce the launch of the Frank Miller Trade Scholarship, a fund dedicated to helping young adults pursue careers in construction, masonry, carpentry, and the trades that keep our community standing strong." A wave of applause rose from the crowd. Frank kept his eyes lowered, but he could feel the warmth of gratitude surrounding him. Local news cameras pivoted toward him, capturing his reaction. He offered a nod, small, modest, just enough to acknowledge the room without claiming it. Sullivan kept going. "This scholarship exists because Frank believes in hard work, because he believes in giving young people the tools he once had to build with his bare hands. This is generosity, leadership, and legacy in action." Another round of applause. Frank exhaled quietly. Not far from the stage, Jacob stood among his classmates, hood pulled low. He hadn't known anything about the scholarship until that morning. Now he stared at the banners showing photos of Frank's projects, the community center, the clinic, the school additions. His friends whispered around him. "Your grandpa did all that," one asked, impressed. Another nudged him. "Dude, he's like a local legend." Jacob's cheeks flushed, this time not from embarrassment, but from a realization he hadn't been prepared for. Just days ago, he mocked the smell of cement. Now everyone around him praised the man who shaped half the town's foundation. He swallowed hard, watching Frank S. tanned quietly behind the crowd, avoiding attention even as it poured over him. On the sidewalk across the street, Michael stood stiffly beside Tara. He hadn't been invited. Neither had she. They only found out because the announcement had aired on the morning news. Michael kept his arms folded, jaw tight. "You didn't know about this," Tara hissed, voice sharp. "He never told you a thing." Michael shook his head, eyes fixed on his father. "No, I didn't." There was something in his expression, confusion mixed with fear. The kind that comes when a person realizes they know far less about someone than they assumed. Tara scoffed loudly. "Unbelievable. He does all of this publicly. This is attention-seeking, Michael. He wants praise, that's all." But even as she spoke, her voice wavered. The crowd's reaction didn't look orchestrated. This wasn't a performance. It was gratitude, pure and unforced. "People like him because he earned it," Michael muttered, surprising even himself. Emily slipped away from her friends and ran toward Frank, beaming. Her eyes sparkled with pride as she wrapped her arm around his. "Grandpa, this is incredible. Everyone's talking about how much you've done for the town." Frank chuckled, shaking his head. "I didn't do this for attention, sweetheart. Just wanted kids who work hard to have a chance." "I know," she said, squeezing his arm. "That's why it matters." A reporter approached. "Mr. Miller, would you like to say a few words?" Frank hesitated, glancing at the crowd, faces full of expectation, admiration, gratitude. He lifted a hand gently. "No speech," he said. "Just thank you. I'm glad the town is supporting something that means a lot to me." His voice carried a soft humility, steady, sincere, the kind that didn't need volume to be heard. The reporter smiled, stepping back. The mayor continued speaking, but the crowd's attention lingered on Frank. Cameras captured his quiet posture, his gentle nods. Nothing about him suggested pride, only purpose. On the sidewalk, Tara's irritation sharpened. "He's playing the hero," she muttered, "making us look ungrateful." Michael didn't respond. He watched his father, really watched him as people lined up to shake his hand. Workers, teachers, parents, teenagers, everyone touched by the buildings he once raised from dirt and steel. For the first time, Michael understood something deeply unsettling. His father didn't need their approval. He never had. Frank was respected by the entire town, silently, steadily, undeniably. Emily tugged on Frank's sleeve. "Are you okay?" Frank smiled down at her. "I'm right where I need to be." As applause rose again around them, he felt no pride, only calm. He didn't need to explain himself. He didn't need to correct anyone. His work, his real legacy, was speaking for him. And tomorrow, when the letters reached his family's doorstep, a different kind of truth would speak even louder. Michael arrived at Paul Reeves's office wearing the expression of a man pretending to be calm while barely holding his nerves together. He had called for the appointment early that morning, his voice casual on the phone. "Just planning for the future, Paul. Want to review Dad's will, to get things organized." But the truth sat heavier, desperation wrapped in false confidence. Paul greeted him with polite professionalism, though his eyes carried the quiet weight of someone who already knew where this meeting would lead. "Come in, Michael. Have a seat." Michael sat, knees bouncing subtly under the table. "Thanks for fitting me in. I just want to make sure everything's set for, well, long-term planning." Paul folded his hands. "You want to review your father's will?" Michael nodded, trying to smile like this was routine. "Yeah, just making sure we're all on the same page. He mentioned once that everything was structured evenly, so I'd like to go over it. For the kids." Legally, ethically, and professionally, Paul had no choice. "As his son, you're allowed to view the filed version," he said. "But I need to warn you, your father recently made changes." Michael froze. "Changes?" Paul opened a drawer and pulled out the updated binder, sliding it across the table. "These are the finalized documents, filed and legally active." Michael flipped open the first page, scanning quickly. His eyes moved, then stopped, then doubled back. His face drained of color. What is this?" he whispered. Paul remained silent, letting him continue. Michael turned the page, his breathing sharpened. He skipped ahead and stumbled onto the inheritance chart. Emily's name sat at the top, primary beneficiary. Nearly everything flowed to her: land, savings, assets. Jacob's line item read, $1. And then his own line. Nothing. He was listed only as a contingent recipient for minor personal items, keepsakes, not assets. His pulse hammered. "This isn't right," he said, voice rising. "This isn't. Dad would never." "Emily. He gave everything to Emily." Paul nodded. "Oh. NCE. Your father's instructions were clear." Michael's hand trembled as he pointed at the clause he couldn't believe existed. "And what is this? Inheritance contingent on respect and empathy. What is that supposed to mean?" "It means exactly what it says," Paul replied calmly. "Your father chose to tie his legacy to demonstrated character, not bloodline." Michael slammed the binder shut. "He blindsided us. He blindsided me, after everything I've done for this family." Paul raised an eyebrow, unmoved. "Michael, your father made this decision after thoughtful review. He wasn't impulsive." Tara's voice sliced into the doorway as she entered, having driven separately. "Let me see it." Michael shoved the binder into her hands. She skimmed it, her expression twisting with outrage. "This is favoritism, plain and simple. He's rewarding Emily because she smiles at him." She snapped the binder shut. "He's punishing us." Paul kept his composure. "Your father is not punishing anyone. He is aligning his estate with his values." Tara stood, shaking her head hard. "Values? This is humiliation." Michael pushed back his chair. "I'm going to talk to him." Paul lifted a hand. "Michael, I strongly advise." But the door had already swung open. Frank was fixing a loose hinge on a kitchen cabinet when he heard the pounding on his door. Not knocking, pounding. He straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag before opening it. Michael stormed inside without waiting. "Why?" he demanded. "Why would you do this?" Frank closed the door calmly. "Do what, son?" "Don't play dumb with me." Michael's voice cracked under the strain. "The will, the inheritance, you gave everything to Emily, you left us with nothing." "Not nothing," Frank corrected, "just what was earned." Tara stepped forward, eyes sharp with accusation. "This is cruelty, Frank. You're dividing the family." Frank looked at her with a stillness that made her falter. "I'm not dividing anything. I'm acknowledging what already existed." Michael paced, fists clenched. "I've worked hard, I've provided for my family, I deserved better from you." Frank stepped closer, his voice low but steady. "Michael, actions shaped your share. Not my anger, not revenge, your actions." Michael stopped pacing. His eyes shone with a mix of fury and disbelief. "You're choosing Emily over your own son." Frank shook his head softly. "I'm choosing respect over entitlement." Silence filled the room, heavy, suffocating. Michael's breath shook. For a moment he looked like he might say something softer, something real, but pride smothered it. "Fine," he snapped. "If that's how you want to play it, then don't expect us to just accept this." Frank remained unshaken. "It's already filed." Michael's face burned red. He turned sharply and walked out, slamming the door behind him. Tara followed, muttering under her breath. Frank stood alone in the quiet house, not triumphant, not relieved. Just steady. They were powerless now, not because he wanted them to be, but because they had made themselves so. And the consequences were only beginning. Jacob showed up at Frank's doorstep just after sunset, shoulders tight, breath uneven, as if he'd spent the whole walk rehearsing what to say. The porch light cast a soft halo over him, making him look younger than 17, stripped of the jokes, the smirks, the careless bravado he used to shield himself. Frank opened the door slowly. Jacob stood rigid, hands shoved deep into his pockets, eyes flicking downward. Can I talk to you?" Jacob asked. Frank stepped aside, nodding him in. No accusation, no tension, just space. Inside, Jacob hovered near the living room, not sitting, not approaching. He braced himself like a boy expecting a punishment, a lecture, a storm waiting to fall. Finally, he forced the words out. "I know you saw Dad's reaction, and Mom is furious. They're saying you planned all this to get back at us." His voice wavered. "And I know you're probably mad at me too, for everything I said, for what I did." Frank didn't rush. He let the boy feel the quiet. "Jacob," Frank said gently, "I'm not angry at you." Jacob blinked, startled. "You're not." Frank shook his head, motioning for him to sit. Jacob hesitated, then lowered himself onto the couch. Frank sat across from him, not towering above him, not imposing judgment, just meeting him where he was. "I don't want you to feel shame," Frank said softly. "I want you to understand." The words disarmed Jacob immediately. He drew a shaky breath, eyes reddening though he tried to hide it. "I didn't mean it the way it sounded," he said. "Not really. I mean, yeah, I said those things, but it's just what everyone around me jokes about. Mom always says blue-collar stuff is beneath our lifestyle. Dad doesn't argue. And my friends," he swallowed hard. "I thought if I didn't laugh along, they'd think I was like you." "Like me?" Frank asked, not offended, just curious. Jacob nodded slowly. "Someone who, well, RKS with their hands, someone people look down on." His voice cracked. "I didn't want to be made fun of." Frank leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His voice came out steady, warm. "Jacob, respect builds futures, not money, not reputation, not image." He pointed gently toward the boy's chest. "What you stand for, that's what builds you." Jacob wiped his face with the sleeve of his hoodie, shoulders shaking, not with guilt, but with a dawning awareness he didn't have words for yet. Tears fell freely now, no longer fought back. "I didn't know," he whispered. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know what you did. Nobody ever told me." Frank nodded. "I know." I thought you were just old, Jacob said through a broken breath. Old and quiet, someone who didn't fit in. Frank gave him a sad, understanding smile. Sometimes generations lose sight of what came before them. It's not your fault alone, but now you know. And once you know, you choose who you become next. Before Jacob could answer, the front door burst open without knocking, Tara's voice slicing through the house like a blade. Jacob, you are coming home right now. Her heels clacked sharply against the hardwood as she stormed in. I should have known he'd drag you into this after poisoning the will. What did he tell you? What lies did he fill your head with? Jacob stiffened, the fragile calm inside him shattering at her tone. Frank rose calm but firm. Tara. She whirled on him. Don't you dare speak to him like he's yours to shape. You've brainwashed my son with your guilt tactics and your working-class martyr stories. Jacob's eyes widened, not out of fear of his mother but out of sudden clarity. This, her dismissal, her pride, her disregard, was the pressure he'd been absorbing for years. Mom, stop, Jacob said quietly. Tara froze. Excuse me. I'm talking to Grandpa, he said, voice trembling but resolute, and I'm staying. Tara's mouth opened, stunned at the defiance she'd never heard from him. Not like this, not so grounded. Jacob, she said sharply, we are leaving. He shook his head. No, I need to hear him, I need to understand. The room fell still. Tara's anger had nowhere to land, no obedient son to control, no intimidated elder to shame. Frank didn't move toward her or argue back. He didn't have to. The choice had already been made. Tara stiffened, grabbing her purse. Fine, she spat, but don't expect sympathy when this all blows up in your faces. She slammed the door behind her, the echo rolling through the house like a fading storm. Silence returned. Jacob wiped the last tears from his cheeks. Can we keep talking? He asked quietly. Frank nodded, his voice soft. We've got time, Jacob, as long as it takes. The boy exhaled in relief, real relief, as he leaned closer, ready to listen for the first time in his life. And Frank knew. This was the moment the generational chain finally broke and began to rebuild. Michael called the family meeting for late evening, though the word meeting didn't fully capture the tension already humming through the walls of his home. Frank stepped inside to find Tara pacing near the fireplace, arms crossed tightly, and Michael standing stiffly in the center of the room, as if preparing for a confrontation he wasn't entirely sure how to win. Emily and Jacob sat together on the couch, unified in a way Frank hadn't seen before, both watching their parents with caution. Dad, Michael said, gesturing sharply for him to sit, we need to talk about the will. Frank didn't move toward the chair. We already did, Michael. No, Tara snapped before Michael could speak again. You blindsided us. You blindsided your own family. We deserve a real explanation. Frank remained standing, hands at his sides, posture calm but unyielding. You want an explanation, he said quietly. Then let's start with a simple question. Michael frowned. What question? Frank's eyes moved between him and Tara. Define respect. The room fell still. Michael blinked as if the question had come in a language he didn't know. Tara's expression tightened, irritation flashing. Emily watched, breath held. Jacob looked down at his hands. Respect, Michael repeated. Dad, this isn't some philosophy lesson. This is about our future. Exactly, Frank replied. A future shaped by your choices, so answer the question. Silence. A long, uncomfortable silence. Tara shifted first, her voice sharp with frustration. This is ridiculous. You're punishing us because we didn't grow up worshiping cement and hard labor. That's not disrespect. That's just having different values. Frank held her gaze, unmoved. Mocking the work that built your life is not a different value, Tara. It's disrespect. Pretending you didn't hear your son humiliate me at dinner is disrespect. Expecting my estate as a guarantee instead of a gift. Michael cut in, voice trembling with anger. You're twisting everything. You're acting like we're villains. We were counting and that inheritance to secure our future. Emily stood suddenly. Dad, stop. Her voice rang out, stronger than anyone expected. You weren't counting on it. You were depending on it because you won't take responsibility for the choices you and Mom made. Tyra's head snapped toward her daughter. Watch your tone. No, Emily said firmly. You watch yours. Grandpa isn't abandoning us. He's reacting to how you've treated him. If anyone abandoned this family, it wasn't him. Michael's face reddened. Emily. Don't, she said sharply. Don't turn this on him. Jacob looked up then, quiet but steady. She's right, he said softly. Tara's mouth fell open. Jacob, don't you start. He flinched at her tone but didn't retreat. I said things I shouldn't have. Grandpa didn't yell at me. He didn't punish me. He showed me who he really is and who I was wrong about. He swallowed. I embarrassed him. You and Dad didn't even care. Michael stared at his son as if seeing him for the first time and not liking what he saw. So now you're taking his side. No, Jacob said. I'm finally seeing the truth. Tara let out a bitter laugh. He's brainwashing both of you. Emily stepped forward. Nobody brainwashed us. We just opened our eyes. Michael turned back to Frank, desperation seeping through every crack in his voice. Dad, please, just reconsider. We're your family. Don't do this to us. Frank looked at him with a sadness deeper than anger. I'm not doing anything to you. I'm doing something because of you, because of what you've shown me. Tara crossed her arms. So that's it, you're cutting us out. Frank's voice remained steady, almost gentle. I'm giving my legacy to the people who value it, not the people who assume they're entitled to it. Michael stepped closer, eyes strained. After everything I've done for this family. What you've done, Frank asked quietly. Michael, what you've done is build an image, not a foundation. The word struck harder than any raised voice could. Michael faltered, shoulders sagging as if the truth had finally pierced his defenses. For years, he had avoided accountability with charm, excuses, or distance. But now, standing in front of the man who laid every piece of his childhood with his own hands, he realized none of those tactics could move someone who had spent a lifetime shaping stone. He had no leverage, no argument, no moral ground to stand on. Dad, his voice thinned, please. Frank stepped back, the space between them final and clear. You cannot manipulate a man who built everything he has with his own hands. The silence that followed settled over the room like dust after a collapse. Michael exhaled sharply, anger, hurt, refusal all tangled together. He grabbed his coat, motioned stiffly for Tara, and headed for the door. This isn't over, he muttered, though even he didn't sound convinced. Frank didn't reply. As the door shut behind them, Emily and Jacob turned toward their grandfather, not seeking answers but standing with him. And for the first time in years, Michael walked away knowing he no longer held the power he once believed he had. The first knock came early in the morning, sharp, impatient, the kind that didn't bother hiding intent. Michael opened the front door to find two contractors standing on the porch, clipboards in hand, expressions carved from stone. Their work trucks idled behind them, exhaust rising into the cold air. Morning, one said, not unkind but without softness. We're here about the outstanding balance on the remodel. Michael forced a tight smile. Yes, I've been meaning to call you. We're just waiting on a few transfers to clear. The contractor didn't blink. It's been 3 months, Mr. Miller. We need payment, all of it. The number on the invoice made Michael's stomach drop, $200,000, just as Tara had warned. He swallowed hard, nodding as if he still had control. I'll get it sorted. You've said that before, the second contractor replied. We can't keep the crew on hold. We need payment by the end of the week. As they walked back to their trucks, Michael closed the door slowly, pressing his forehead against the wood. The weight of everything he'd been juggling crashed harder than he expected. Behind him, Tara's voice cut through the foyer. What did they want? He turned, trying to steady his face. They're demanding the full payment. Tara's eyes widened with panic and then hardened. Michael, we cannot afford to fall apart right now. Do you understand what that would look like? Our reputation, our home, Jacob and Emily's school. She stepped toward him, voice rising. If we go bankrupt because of your mismanagement. My mismanagement, Michael snapped before he could stop himself. You insisted on the high-end finishes. You picked the designer who doubled our costs. Tara's expression sharpened like glass. Don't put this on me. She crossed her arms tightly. Fix it. I am not losing everything because you failed to secure your father's inheritance. If this family goes down, I won't be staying with you through the collapse. The threat landed harder than the contractor's invoice. Tara, his voice cracked. You just leave. Fix it, she repeated, turning away. By afternoon, Michael sat in a bank office, his knee bouncing uncontrollably as a loan officer typed briskly at her computer. He wore his best suit, rehearsed his calm, but the air felt thinner with every pass. In second. Finally, she looked up. I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. Your credit score has dropped significantly. With your current debt-to-income ratio, we can't approve the loan. Michael blinked. No, there has to be another option. A line of credit, a refinance, something. She shook her head, professional but unmoved. Not with your current liabilities. The room felt like it tilted. His breath hitched. Please, I just need time. I just need anything. I'm sorry, she repeated. He left the bank with numb fingers, the cold wind slapping his face as if the world itself had run out of patience. That evening, desperation drove him to his truck. He didn't call ahead, didn't prepare a speech. He simply drove to Frank's house, heart pounding, mind unraveling. When Frank opened the door, Michael stood there, shoulders shaking, eyes wild with fear and exhaustion. I need your help, he said immediately. Dad, please, we're drowning. The remodel, the loans, Tara's talking about leaving. I can't lose everything. Frank stepped back, letting him inside, but his expression stayed calm. Not cold, not angry, just steady. Sit down, Michael. Michael dropped onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. If you just undo the will, change it back, we'll be okay. We'll be safe. You owe me that. I'm your son. Frank sat across from him, hands resting on his knees. Michael, he said softly, I don't owe you a life you failed to build. Michael jerked his head up, face twisting. So you're punishing me for a joke, for one stupid night. This isn't punishment, Frank replied. It's principle. I worked for everything I have. I wanted to go to those who honor where it came from. You don't. That's not fair, Michael choked out. I've sacrificed for my family. You've sacrificed for your image, Frank corrected gently. Michael's face crumpled then, anger collapsing into raw fear. He pressed his hands to his eyes, shoulders shaking violently. Dad, please, I don't know what to do. Jacob, who had been lingering quietly in the hallway, froze at the sight of his father breaking down, something he had never witnessed, never imagined. The strong, confident man he idolized in childhood now looked small, cornered, almost unrecognizable. Frank rose, moved closer, and spoke with quiet sorrow. I'm sorry you're hurting, but I cannot solve the consequences of choices you refuse to face. Michael shook his head again and again, sobbing harder. I thought you'd always save us. Frank's voice remained steady. It's time you learn to stand on your own foundation. The room went silent, except for the sound of Michael's muffled breakdown. Jacob watched with wide, conflicted eyes. And Frank knew the storm was far from over. Jacob showed up at the community center before sunrise, hood pulled up, hands buried in his pockets, breath hanging in the morning cold like a confession he wasn't ready to voice. The building loomed quietly in front of him, its brick walls tinted blue under the early light. Workers were already unloading bags of cement, the sound of tools echoing softly in the open air. He hesitated at the entrance until one of the supervisors spotted him. "You here to volunteer?" Jacob nodded awkwardly. "Yeah, my grandpa said I could help." A few minutes later, Frank walked out from behind the tool shed, wiping his hands on a rag. He paused when he saw Jacob, surprised but not startled. Jacob looked different. No swagger, no smirk, just an earnest, uncertain determination. "Morning," Frank said, voice warm but not overly indulgent. "Morning, Grandpa," Jacob replied. "Where do I start?" Frank studied him for a moment as if measuring sincerity. Then he motioned him forward. "Come on, let's get you to work." They walked toward the mixing station, where bags of cement stacked high waited to be opened. The air smelled like dust and cold steel. Frank handed Jacob a pair of gloves, thick, worn but sturdy. "This is how your dad learned," Frank said quietly, "right in this yard." Jacob nodded, absorbing that more deeply than he let on. Frank demonstrated slowly, methodically, cutting open the cement bag, pouring the powder into the mixer, adding water in careful increments. He explained texture, consistency, timing, not lecturing, teaching. Jacob watched closely, then stepped forward to try it himself. His first attempt splashed too much water, turning the mix thin and sloppy. Frank didn't laugh, didn't critique sharply. He simply said, "Try again, with patience this time." Jacob swallowed, nodded, and lifted another bag. Dust puffed around him as he poured. He adjusted the water carefully, mimicking Frank's rhythm. The mixer churned, and when the cement thickened to the right, smooth consistency, Frank gave a small, approving nod. "There you go," he said. "Now you're doing it." A subtle pride flickered through Jacob's expression, uncertain but real. They worked side by side for hours, carrying buckets, smoothing edges, laying the early groundwork. Arcade for a new outdoor storage unit the center needed. The labor was heavy, repetitive, unforgiving, but something in it grounded Jacob. For the first time, he felt the weight of the work instead of mocking it, the steadiness, the precision, the responsibility. Around midday, Emily arrived with a thermos of hot chocolate. She froze when she saw Jacob covered in dust, sleeves rolled up, sweat marking his forehead. "You're actually working," she said, eyes widening. Jacob shrugged, embarrassed but proud. "Yeah, I wanted to try." Emily smiled, that soft, supportive smile she usually saved only for Frank. "I'm proud of you, Jake, really proud." Jacob's throat tightened, not from emotion he understood, but from the sensation of becoming someone new and being seen for it. Emily handed Frank the thermos, then hugged Jacob briefly before leaving to help inside. Her praise lingered in the air long after she'd gone. As afternoon settled in, Jacob's movements grew smoother. He learned how to level a surface, how to brace a frame, how to keep his mind steady when his muscles ached. Frank watched him quietly, offering correction only when necessary, letting the boy find his own rhythm. At one point, Jacob paused, staring down at his hands, dusty, scratched, tired. The same kind of hands he once mocked. "You okay?" Frank asked. Jacob nodded slowly. "I didn't know it felt like this," he said. "Like you're building something real, something that'll stay." Frank smiled faintly. "Most people don't." Jacob looked up, eyes sharper now, more grounded. "I get why people respect you," he said softly. "It's not because you built buildings. It's because you built lives, futures." Frank's chest warmed at the words, not pride but relief. A kind of generational bridge beginning to rebuild itself, plank by plank. By dusk, the sky turned orange, shadows stretching long across the yard. Workers packed up, offering Frank a nod and Jacob a pat on the back, welcoming him not as a guest but as one of them. When the yard finally quieted, Jacob stood beside Frank, breathing heavily, covered in dust. "Grandpa," he said after a long pause. "Yes, Jacob." The boy's voice softened, almost reverent. Will you teach me everything you know? The question landed like a seed planted in soil Frank thought had long gone barren. He felt something settle inside him, hope, warm and unexpected. He rested a hand on Jacob's shoulder. "If you're ready to learn," he said, "I'm ready to teach." Jacob nodded firmly. For the first time, he truly was. Michael didn't mean to drive past the community center that afternoon. He had been circling town aimlessly, trying to outrun the collapse he could feel closing in from every direction. His phone buzzed with unpaid invoice reminders, Tara's texts stacked with anger, and the echo of his father's refusal throbbed in his chest like a fresh bruise. When he slowed at a stop sign, he caught sight of movement through the chain-link fence. Jacob, lugging a bucket of wet cement beside Frank, both of them covered in dust, both laughing softly, both working in sync as if they'd been doing it together for years. Michael's breath snagged in his throat. He watched his son, shoulders squared, posture grounded, not the timid boy he often scolded, not the sarcastic teenager he barely understood, but a young man learning the world from the man Michael had spent years pretending had nothing left to teach. Frank corrected Jacob's grip on a trowel. Jacob listened, really listened. A seed of jealousy, sharp, unfamiliar, lodged beneath Michael's ribs. "He's replacing me," he thought. "My father is replacing me with my own son." For a moment, he couldn't breathe. He sped away from the curb before either of them noticed him. When he got home, Tara was standing in the living room with two suitcases zipped and upright. Her expression was cold, sharpened by disappointment and self-preservation. "What is this?" Michael asked. She crossed her arms. "I'm staying with my sister for a while." His heart thudded painfully. "Tara, come on, don't do this." "No," she snapped. "You did this. You ruined everything. Do you get that?" She stepped closer, eyes blazing. "Your father was our future, our security, and you pushed him away. Now look at us, humiliated, drowning in debt, and cut out of the only inheritance that mattered." Michael flinched. "I didn't know he'd changed the will." "You should have," she said bitterly. "You should have respected him, or at the very least kept Jacob in line." She grabbed the handle of her suitcase. "I'm not going down with a sinking ship. Not again." "Tara, please," Michael said, voice cracking. "Don't just walk away." "I'll come back when you fix this," she said. "If you can fix it." Then she left, letting the door close behind her like the final strike of a gavel. Michael stood alone in the silence that followed, a silence filled not with anger, but the undeniable truth that everything he'd been hiding from was now standing in front of him. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Michael drove to Frank's house again, not with rehearsed manipulation, not with entitlement. He walked up the porch steps slowly, like a man approaching judgment. Frank opened the door before he could knock. He must have seen the car through the window. Michael's voice faltered. "Dad, can I come in?" Frank stepped aside. "Of course." Inside, Michael stood for a long moment with his hands buried in his pockets, head lowered, shoulders slumped. He wasn't pacing now. There was no fire, just exhaustion. "I saw Jacob with you today," he said quietly. "He looked happy." Frank nodded. "He's learning fast." Michael swallowed hard. "I felt replaced." Frank didn't soften the truth. "I didn't replace you, Michael. You stepped away." He paused. "But that doesn't mean the door's closed." Michael sat down heavily at the table. His eyes looked older than his years, hollowed out by choices he could no longer defend. "Dad, I messed up. For a long time. I let Tara talk down about your work. I laughed when Jacob made that joke. I cared more about appearances than about respect." His voice broke. "And now everything's falling apart." Frank listened without interrupting. "For the first time," Michael whispered, "I see how badly I wronged you, and I'm not here to ask for money." His chest shook. "I'm just asking for forgiveness." The words landed fragile and trembling, like something rarely spoken by him. Frank exhaled slowly, the weight of years between them drifting somewhere softer. "Michael," he said gently, "compassion is possible, it always has been." He leaned forward. "But trust takes time, it has to be rebuilt." Michael nodded, tears finally slipping free. I know." He covered his face with both hands, crying, not with the anger or fear Jacob had seen earlier, but with a humility that stripped him bare. The sound was quiet, pained, almost boyish, like the child he once was resurfacing after decades buried under pride. Frank rested a steady hand on his son's shoulder. Not absolution, not yet, but a beginning. Behind them in the hallway, Jacob had stopped mid-step, watching his father cry for the first time in his life, watching a man break open not from defeat, but from truth. And for the first time, something fragile and unfinished settled over all of them. Something that might, if handled carefully, become healing. Frank's house glowed softly in the early evening, nothing extravagant, just a string of white lights along the porch and a small tree visible through the front window. The table inside was set for four, modest but warm. Simple plates, cloth napkins, a roasted chicken instead of turkey. It was the kind of Christmas meal built not on spectacle, but on intention. He moved slowly around the kitchen, smoothing the tablecloth even though it didn't need smoothing, adjusting the candles though they were already straight. Hosting tonight mattered in a way even he hadn't prepared for. It wasn't about the food. It wasn't even about the holiday. It was about beginning again. A knock sounded light, familiar. Frank opened the door to find Emily beaming, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright with something that looked like hope. Jacob stood beside her, hands behind his back, shifting nervously. "Merry Christmas, Grandpa," Emily said, wrapping her arms around him before he could reply. Jacob stepped forward more slowly. "Merry Christmas," he echoed, quieter but sincere. Frank smiled. "Come on in." As they stepped inside, Jacob pulled something from behind his back, a small object wrapped in brown paper and tied clumsily with twine. "I made something," he said, holding it out awkwardly. "For you." Frank took it carefully, unwrapping the paper. Inside was a handcrafted ornament, simple, round, made from cement smoothed into a perfect sphere. The initials FM were etched into the center, not perfectly, but with care. Jacob swallowed. "I used the mix you showed me, the one you said your dad taught you. I wanted to make something that lasts." Frank's throat tightened. The ornament weighed almost nothing in his hand, yet it felt heavier than anything he'd received in years. This wasn't pity. This wasn't obligation. This was respect, real, earned, freely given. His eyes watered, but he masked it with a smile. "It's perfect, Jacob, thank you." Relief washed over the boy's face, softening him completely. Emily nudged him, proud. They settled at the table, laughter flowing easily between bites, stories drifting from one person to the next. Jacob spoke about volunteering at the community center. Emily talked about her plans to help with the scholarship program at school. Frank listened, heart swelling with something he thought he'd lost forever. Hoping. Then came the second knock. It was hesitant, 3 soft taps followed by silence. Emily looked toward the door. Jacob stiffened. Frank rose slowly. He opened the door to find Michael stand. Alone, hands shoved deep into his coat pockets, shoulders hunched. He looked smaller than usual, less polished, less certain. "Dad," Michael said, voice barely above a breath. "I didn't know if I should come." Frank held his gaze for a long moment. The cold from outside drifted in, carrying the weight of everything that had happened, everything that still wasn't healed. "You're welcome to join us," Frank said finally. Michael's shoulders sagged with quiet relief. He stepped inside cautiously, as if afraid one wrong move would shatter the fragile peace. Emily greeted him with a careful smile. Jacob didn't speak, but he didn't turn away either. That alone felt like progress. They sat, Michael looked down at his plate, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "Thank you for having me," he murmured. Frank nodded. "We're not pretending nothing happened," he said, voice steady. "But we can talk honestly. That's a place to start." Michael swallowed hard. "I'd like that. I want to do better." The table fell quiet, not heavy, not tense, just thoughtful. A recognition of wounds acknowledged, not forgotten. But the silence wasn't a wall, it was a doorway. Conversation returned slowly, tentatively. Michael asked Jacob about the construction yard. Jacob spoke with pride, not hostility. Emily filled the gaps, smoothing the edges with her gentle steadiness. Even Michael managed a small smile when Frank teased him about never lifting a cement bag properly, even in his youth. They weren't fixed, they weren't whole. But they were trying. And for Frank, that mattered more than any inheritance, any legal document, any material victory. What he felt at that table wasn't the triumph of being right. It was the quiet warmth of legacy returning to where it belonged. Legacy not measured in wealth, but in understanding, in respect, in rebuilding something that once cracked. As dinner wound down, Frank looked around the table, a granddaughter glowing with pride, a grandson finding his path, a son humbled into honesty. For the first time in years, he felt something settling inside him. Not closure, not revenge, but restoration. A foundation being rebuilt, slowly, carefully, by the very hands he once feared would tear it apart. And though tomorrow would bring new challenges, new conversations, new reckonings, tonight was enough. Tonight, the family finally began to bridge what they had broken. The next morning, the house was still quiet when Frank stepped into his study, sunlight stretching across the wooden floor like a slow invitation. He opened the drawer of his old drafting table, the one he hadn't touched in years, and pulled out a thick roll of blueprints held together with a faded rubber band. The paper crackled softly, worn from time but preserved with care. He carried them to the living room just as Jacob appeared in the doorway, hair messy, hands still dusty from yesterday's work even though he'd washed them twice. He looked different now, more present, more grounded, as if something inside him had clicked into place. "What's that?" Jacob asked, stepping closer. Frank unrolled the blueprints across the dining table, smoothing the edges with his palms. The lines stretched out in perfect symmetry, walls, beams, loads, elevations, each page a silent testament to decades of labor. "These," Frank said quietly, "are the bones of this town." Jacob leaned in, eyes widening as he scanned the first sheet. "This is the community center." "That's right." Jacob traced the outline with his fingertip, astonished. "You drew this?" "I built it first in here," Frank said, tapping the side of his head, "before I ever touched a shovel." He moved to the next sheet. "This one is the north wing of the clinic. And this," he pulled out a larger, yellowing page, "this is the blueprint for the elementary school you and your sister went to." Jacob froze, staring at the familiar structure in an entirely new way. "You built my school." Frank nodded softly. Jacob kept turning pages, housing developments, municipal buildings, the framing plan for the fire station, the early sketches for the youth courts. Each new blueprint deepened his silence, but it wasn't confusion. It was reverence. Michael, who had been lingering quietly in the hallway, stepped farther into the room. He didn't interrupt. He didn't sit. He simply stood there, watching the realization dawn across his son's face, watching what he himself had taken for granted all his life. Jacob lifted one blueprint carefully, holding it like something sacred. "I had no idea you made all this," he whispered. "You weren't supposed to," Frank said gently. "I didn't build them for recognition. I built them because they were needed." Jacob swallowed, emotion thickening his voice. "But it's everything, half the town." Frank rested a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Hard work leaves fingerprints, Jacob, even if people stop seeing them." The words hung in the air, quiet but solid. Michael exhaled slowly, remorse flickering across his face as he watched his father, not the man he had dismissed, but the builder he had forgotten. He stepped forward not to speak, but to see. Really see. Blueprints he'd ignored all his life suddenly took on a weight he could no longer avoid. Jacob turned back to his grandfather. "Why didn't you ever show us these?" Frank smiled softly. "Because your future wasn't supposed to be built by looking back. It was supposed to be built by learning forward." His grip on Jacob's shoulder tightened just slightly. "But now, I think you're ready." Jacob looked down at the scattered sheets, lines of labor, years of sweat, a legacy etched in pencil and cement. He understood them now in a way he never could have when he mocked Frank at that dinner table. Understanding had shape now, and foundation. Frank tapped the blueprint closest to Jacob. "This," he said, "is your foundation too, not the buildings, not the work, the respect behind them, the discipline, the purpose." Jacob's breath trembled. His eyes filled suddenly, unexpectedly. And before he could think, before he could stop himself, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms tightly around his grandfather. Frank stiffened in surprise, then slowly returned the embrace, feeling the sincerity in Jacob's grip, the apology woven into the hug, the gratitude stitched between the boy's words. Jacob whispered against his shoulder, voice cracking, "I'm proud of you, Grandpa." Frank closed his eyes, not to hide emotion, but to finally let it rise. Respect, real, humble, earned, had returned to him not by force but by truth. He pulled back, brushing Jacob's hair aside like he used to when the boy was small. "I'm proud of you too," he said, "for choosing who you want to become." Michael watched from a few steps away, his eyes wet, his posture unsteady. He saw clearly now the distance he had let form, the lineage he almost broke, and the chance, small but real, that he could rebuild it. Frank gently rolled the blueprints back together, tying them loosely. The house felt still, grounded, peaceful. A new future had begun forming, not in ink, not in cement, but in understanding. As Frank looked at his grandson, this boy who once mocked the smell of cement, now standing tall with newfound reverence, he felt the truth settle over him like a warm evening blanket. That night, my grandson finally understood. The future he wanted was built by the hands he once mocked.